What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? This is the 2030 Project. It's a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it in this country. We endeavor to uncover what's been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, but then what needs to come next? The 2030 Project tackles some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing this country today. I'm Dave Trafford, and thanks for joining us. In this episode, we're going to explore the need to address social infrastructure, which includes everything from universal daycare to high-speed internet access, from food nutrition, yes, to Peppa the Pig. The argument here is it's necessary to broaden our perspective in order to create a foundation for a future that provides resilience, not just for the system, but for the citizens who struggle with poverty. And we're going to find out one of the biggest challenges in creating solutions is our own cultural and institutional misunderstanding or misstatement of what it means to live in poverty.
The poverty reduction strategy chose a definition of poverty that is only about material deprivation. We're the only country that uses that kind of measure, that we don't consider a relative measure. What is happening in the broader society?
When you look at culture, when you look at how people discuss poverty, they don't discuss it in terms of buying things. That's not what people discuss. So then why is the government using a definition that actually doesn't match what their own voters think?
Ujwal Arkalgud is a cultural anthropologist and founder of Motivbase.
As anthropologists, we study meaning, and our preoccupation is understanding not just what people are talking about issues, ideas, trends, but to decode the implicit meanings being communicated and to understand how those implicit meanings teach us about where culture and issues are headed into the future.
And we're also joined by Leila Sarangi. She's the Director of Social Action with Family Service Toronto, and she serves as the National Director for Campaign 2000, which is aimed at ending child and family poverty here in Canada. Of course, the name Campaign 2000 only underlines the treadmill-like challenge of reducing, let alone eliminating poverty. The goal is more than 20 years overdue.
Somebody told me recently it's a bit sassy to say, Campaign 2000. We are 21 years past the goal to eradicate child poverty. And we are past that goal because when the federal government passed that resolution, that beautiful vision, there was no programs, no budget, no plan on how they were going to do it. And so a big part of our work is putting forth that platform. We have a range of achievable policies that can be put in place to get us on that path to actually eradicating child poverty. So we're thinking bolder than what the National Poverty Reduction Strategy's goal, which is to end cut poverty in half. We are really talking about the end of poverty, which is we really do believe something that can happen. And I'll just say that, when we think about the concept of poverty, it is a social construct. It's something that we have conceptualized and defined, and it is not inevitable. It actually is something that affects marginalized communities disproportionately, and we've really seen this through the pandemic. But we know, for example, First Nations children, Inuit, Métis, children and families with disabilities, lone mothers, all of these groups have significantly higher rates of poverty and child poverty. And that's because of the systems that are in place and the way our policies are being realized in communities that are creating barriers to equitable solutions and thriving communities.
Okay, so you've actually outlined an entirely new podcast series for us here because there's so many things that you've sort of unveiled and unleashed in that part of it. But one of the things that I do want to get to is that at the essence of the strategy we currently are working with, those whom I've spoken to over the course of the series so far will put up their hand and say there's some positive things going on here. There actually is work being done that is helping and making a difference, and we're seeing it, particularly for kids and seniors in this country, where the poverty rates are going down. Now, introduce COVID-19 into all of this. They're talking about reducing poverty by 50%. They might have to extend that calendar date. You're talking about eradicating it. So, you have just created a much deeper hole for you to dig yourself out of in many respects, only because of the pandemic. I mean, how realistic is that?
So I am not denying that there is a lot of work to be done. And I will say that actually, there are some positive things happening. And the Canada Child Benefit, for example, did serve to lift a number of children out of poverty. But I want to just challenge that a little. The annual report card that we put out in 2020, there's a lag in the data. So we were looking at 2018 numbers, which is pre-pandemic. And what we found in our report card is that the year that the child benefit in 2016, when it was implemented, it did have a significant impact. The child poverty rate dropped down to 18.2%. It dropped by a couple of percentage points, which is more significant than what we've ever seen in terms of a year-over-year drop. But subsequent to that, without further investments into that program, or really any other kinds of meaningful programs, what we saw was a flattening of the decline in the rate. So between 2017 and 2018, the child only less than 20,000 children across the country, additional children were lifted out of poverty. The national rate went from 18.7% to 18.2%, less than half a percentage point difference. So before the pandemic, families, we weren't seeing those kinds of declines. So I know that people and people working in this area and policy experts like to point to the child benefit. It is a good tool for people and a good program for people who can access it. But there's still a lot of barriers, and there is not enough of it to go around to make that kind of substantial difference. We need to take that model. We need to make it even more accessible for families, for example, with precarious immigration status, or families who are in informal care arrangements, and make sure that they can access it. These are very vulnerable families. And then also make sure that we're continuing to make additional financial investments into that program so more families can be lifted up above the poverty line. There are more than 1.3 million children in the country who are living in poverty. So it's still a very large number. So there's a lot of work to do, but there's definitely ways to invest and policies and programs to create to make sure we are on that right path.
Okay, so let's dig in a little bit on that idea. Ujwal, you being the cultural anthropologist, I've heard you say that, the decisions and the things that happen now vis-a-vis the change really going to be felt 10 years from now. That's what, and we sort of underestimate the impact of that. The folks at Daily Bread will tell me that we are still feeling the effects, for example, of the 2008-2009 financial crisis because of demand on their services. Now they're saying we're probably not going to see that peak because of this for another 3 or 4 years. When we start to look at policy, as Leila's talking about, and you start to kind of crystal ball this in terms of what's happening now, the effect that we are going to see a decade from now or need to address, that becomes the sort of the secret sauce in any kind of real effective policy development, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of an anthropologist, obviously, while I may not be able to contribute to this conversation in terms of the effectiveness of the policies themselves, what I can contribute is on how consumers, human beings, people think about these policies and how people think about poverty and what is it that really drives a change in their minds, in their mindsets. And fundamentally, we could argue that could play a significant role, not just in obviously how people vote, but in the amount of support and pressure that various governments and bodies get in implementing the right solutions. And one of the fundamental things that we see that's very different, because if you look at the conversation around poverty, a lot of it generally is about policy, legislation, assistance programs, and so on. But when you look at what people discuss, the meanings people assign to poverty, it's more so the lens of what they can or cannot do in life, not what they can or cannot get. So there's something very interesting here, right? There's a bit of a separation, because in terms of the poverty discussion, we talk a lot about inputs. The consumer talks about outputs. And the reason I bring that up is because the output conversation, from our perspective, is just as important as the input conversation, because the output conversation, and we can unpack this further as we go along, allows us to bring people along for the ride, right? It allows us to bring and include and involve the middle class, the upper middle class. It allows us to involve citizens who are not directly impacted perhaps by this in the same way, or they don't think they are, but it allows us to bring them along the ride. And I think that makes a huge difference in ultimately achieving the types of goals we're talking about.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about that in terms of the forgotten poor in one of our episodes. And there's a certain stigma around the forgotten poor, that they're just lazy. They just want to collect whatever benefits they can. And there's that stigma kind of drives it all down and becomes sort of that obstacle that we have to overcome. And I guess, Ujwal, what you're getting at is almost to the point where we have to find what I would call that emotional button that makes poverty relevant to me, the privileged white guy living in Don Mills in Ontario.
Sure. And I mean, I'll give you one example of that, right? So when we think about the conversation and the meanings around poverty from the consumer's lens, one of the things you'll see is a discussion about creating or living in an inclusive economy. And one definition of that is education, right? And this is not just about access to education. This is also about dealing with the prestige and I'm going to throw a sociological term here, the symbolic violence that is pervasive in the multi-tiered education system that we all exist within, right? And just to bring that down a little bit and make it tangible, it's literally like saying, if I come from a poor family, I am less likely to go to a so-called top tier university, and thereby spend the rest of my life being rejected for all the jobs that I could have been the best candidate for. Just as a little bit of hyperbole, but an important example, right? So this is one among numerous other such ways in which people make poverty quite tangible in terms of the conversation and how it matters to them. And I think those are sort of the, let's call them trigger points or heartstrings to pull at. I think that's fascinating to us because it engages and involves more people in a conversation that really should be for everybody.
Well, one of the conversations that's going on is in the United States. And as we record this session, they are struggling in Washington right now with dealing with President Biden's infrastructure package. And while that might not sound like it has anything to do with what we've just been talking about, it struck me back in the spring when this was first presented, because what we have included in the infrastructure beyond building bridges and roads and hospitals and, large buildings, etc., is the inclusion of things like daycare. Now, admittedly, they're refurbishing daycare buildings, but they're also, Leila, extending it to the idea that the subsidy or the cost of daycare needs to be considered at the same time as the daycare building as important to the economy. And it struck this really interesting chord. I don't think just south of the border. I think a lot of people kind of raised an eyebrow and thought, really? Daycare subsidies are infrastructure? If you look at them from the economic impact that building that bridge has, I think there's an argument there.
I think there is so much weight behind that argument. So we know that the way this pandemic disproportionately impacted people, we've been hearing this pandemic being called a she-cession because the economy had pushed out women out of the labor force when schools shut down, when we all were asked to stay safe at home. That put an enormous amount of pressure on women and female caregivers and mothers who couldn't then, or who were struggling with, homeschooling. And if they were able to work from home, working from home, I'm a single mother. I have 3 children at home, and I felt that struggle. And I was still lucky enough to have a job and work from home and manage the children. But the sectors that shut down were female-dominated sectors. So we saw lots of women. We saw female labor force participation roll back to what it was in the 1980s. And then we also, on the other hand, saw those sectors that were essential to the running of the economy, the emergency workers in the grocery stores, the cashiers, low-paid, racialized women working precariously were the ones who were making sure we got our food on the table. Childcare is such a key component in so many ways. In Ontario, where I'm located, Ontario was one of the first provinces at the beginning of the pandemic to recognize the essential nature of childcare and actually opened up spots for essential workers, for hospital workers, so that they had somewhere to place their children so they could go to work and take care of people. That's the kind of building block that we need to build on for a childcare system. There is the infrastructure build. We can create, we can do what we usually do in times of recession and invest in the build and the infrastructure. And we can attach things like community benefit agreements. So those jobs are local, they're decent, and people who are working in that community have access to those jobs. But it's also about the workforce, the human infrastructure. We can create a decent workforce where there is, health and safety standards, decent pay, access to sick days for a workforce that is largely racialized women within the child care system. And then, considering the work that I do on child and family poverty, and to Ujwal's earlier point about education, these kinds of programs and policies are equalizers for our kids, right? When you're providing high quality childcare, you're reducing inequities and you're giving a fair chance to all of those children, regardless of the background that they're coming from.
Yeah, and just to add to that or build on that, Leila, another area, for example, talking about extending the definition of infrastructure, right? I would have loved to see a wider conversation on food and nutrition as well, as an example. And I'll give you a very tangible example. If you look at poorer communities, and this is not necessarily the poorest, but the poorer communities, one of the things you'll find is, exactly to Leila's earlier point, a lot of people are working either shift jobs, service sector jobs, they're working hourly. They may be the only caregiver at home with children. And we can't possibly expect this person to come home after working, let's say, 2 or 3 shift jobs, 15-hour day, and then cook up a storm and make some sort of a healthy gourmet meal. It's not going to happen, right? So what does happen in that situation? They buy packaged food, they buy prepared food. And then as a result, children don't get access to the type of nutrition that somebody in a wealthier household gets access to. Now, typically, the economist's argument of that has been, and I've heard and read this many times, we tried increasing the produce section in poorer communities, but nobody bought fresh produce. So clearly, they don't want to eat it, right? That's the economist's argument. And that's the classic sort of cringeworthy argument, because it shows you that there's absolutely no effort made to understand the realities of human life, right? You do 3 shift jobs a day, come home and try to make a kale salad, and I'll give you a medal, because that's not going to happen. So I think that's another area where I think we need to expand possibly the definition of infrastructure. Why aren't we pushing innovation in food and nutrition, for example, in these communities for such families, so that they can still deliver nutritionally dense foods to their children despite the circumstances?
The argument will refrain to, well, we've always done it this way. And if we learn nothing else from the pandemic, is that, well, we can't be using that phrase much anymore. one of the things that has become apparent, and you both touched on it, from an educational perspective, from the work at home perspective, is the whole idea, for example, of access to the internet. Just that it becomes a lifeline now. So much of the service that we are expecting and we requires high-speed broadband. And, I wonder when we begin to break that mold, Ujwal, and where it becomes a bit of a fire on the desk for some people to say, all right, we have to sort of not break the system, but flatten it out a little bit and really take a broader perspective. We need a greater peripheral view of what this is all about, because it does become a matter of economic development right down to the dinner table.
Yeah, I mean, there's I'll give you one example. We were actually doing some research in this space, and a lot of the conversation among consumers is actually about, kids or, kids in their children's classrooms that don't have as much exposure, for example, to a lot of the cartoons and the television shows that kids watch these days, right? So as an example, consumers talk about how, my kid has a friend in class doesn't know what Peppa Pig is. And I give this example because part of that becomes sort of it's a way of excluding somebody because they're not up on the lingo. Part of it is that, and I'm by no means advocating for television time for children, but there is some amount of learning that happens on these shows. I mean, I've seen this with my own daughter. She gets 30 minutes or something of screen time a day. It has improved her grammar, her ability to articulate ideas. So the reason I'm going into this is because every little element of learning involves the internet these days. It doesn't just have to be a show. It could be, some song you play. It could be listening to music online, accessing a broader variety of music for your children to listen to. It could be anything. Everything requires the internet. And the problem is that not only does it create exclusion, literally in terms of the social relationships that kids have, but it also, in many ways, excludes opportunities for kids to learn things that their peers aren't learning. And we can see people discussing this actively. And I think that's a very positive thing when it comes to poverty.
Yeah, I guess, Leila, that's got to be the key here, is that if we wait for government and policymakers to do this, well, we're back to campaign 2000, by the way. So it's not as if this really has to be literally and figuratively a grassroots movement. And as Ujwal points out, the dinner table conversation becomes a pretty important place to start that. And because there's an awareness, or there are good questions, or there's curiosity about it. But immediately we'll start to talk about this. The question is going to be, well, what's it going to cost? It's going to cost us a fortune to have daycare, or it's going to cost us a fortune to, include high-speed broadband. It's a difficult obstacle to overcome.
There are Nordic countries that approach access to broadband as a fundamental human right. And I think we need to start taking that perspective on services. Poverty is, as Ujwal said earlier, not just about not being able to afford things. This is about a violation of our human rights, of all the UN declarations that we have signed on to. So yes, we need absolutely change comes from building power in communities, from those grassroots movements, whether you're protesting on the street or you're having the kitchen table conversation and challenging or having these discussions with your own family and friends. It takes all of these kinds of ways. It also takes federal leadership. And so I'm just going to pull it back to the poverty reduction strategy, which chose a definition of poverty that is only about material deprivation. We're the only country that uses that kind of measure, that we don't consider a relative measure. What is happening in the broader society? Does everybody have the same access to quality of life that their neighbors have? Are we reducing inequalities? We need federal leadership on that. And we are a wealthy nation. There is no reason. I mean, we're recording this the day after the first official National Truth and Reconciliation Day. There is no reason children in this country should not have access to clean drinking water, should not have access to, we're talking about social infrastructure, should not have access to decent housing. There's no reason. We can afford these things. It's about how the federal government and all governments, it's how they decide to spend money and who they are holding accountable for paying taxes. And I'm just going to give a quick example here. One of the campaigns that we've been organizing throughout the pandemic, we've called it a CERB amnesty campaign. The Canadian Emergency Response Benefit was the first benefit that the federal government launched at the very beginning of the pandemic. It gave $2,000 a month to individuals who lost work because of the economic shutdown as a result of the pandemic. The government said, we're not going to leave anybody behind. They created this very quick, very low barrier program. And 2 days after you apply, you got the money into your bank account. We know that where there's political will, the governments can move fast and spend. But what they then did was turn around and say, well, actually, a lot of families or a lot of people may not have met the requirements. So they spent $1 million to send letters to all these families to pay back this emergency response benefit. So they're going down that track instead of holding accountable, some of these major corporations that have, because of the change in how we consume television or purchase groceries, all of these, everything has moved online, but we're not, appropriately taxing places like Netflix or Amazon, who have made millions and millions and millions of dollars over the pandemic. So I think we just need to, kind of shift the narrative and shift the focus. And from a values-based perspective, think about, okay, really, what are the values here? What is that new rebuild and the vision we have for rebuilding of our society? I do think it is possible.
And Leila, I wanted to pick up on something you said, because a large part of our work, especially on social issues, is to, in fact, demonstrate to companies, because most of our clients are large corporations, to demonstrate to them that there's money to be made in social programs. There's money to be made in doing good. And a lot of that is to demonstrate that, hey, the people who buy from you care about it. So the people who buy from you care that there is not just a gender neutral bathroom, but you have new policies for hiring, that you make room for people who are trans or non-binary or what have you. People care about that, and it trickles down into your bottom line. And a lot of our job is to show that by demonstrating that culture has evolved enough that there's enough people who care about these issues. There are enough people who value these issues. The reason I bring this up is because, you brought up an important point, which is, why is it that we in Canada are using a material definition of what is poverty, right? A material deprivation definition. Why are we using that when other countries don't necessarily do that? And, a lot of it is, or a lot of the solutions could lie in how we might be able to demonstrate that actually, hey, Liberal Party or Conservatives or whoever, here are the opportunities for you in terms of grabbing more votes next election, right? Here's how you are going to, quote unquote, make money, as in get elected, because people care about a conversation around poverty. And here are the things that people care about, because the interesting thing is, when you look at culture, when you look at how people discuss poverty, they don't discuss it in terms of buying things. That's not what people discuss. So then why is the government using a definition that actually doesn't match what their own voters think? I think that's an interesting conversation.
And maybe that's why we are still talking about a campaign 2000, because we have a citizenry who is on one lane and a government policy brain completely on another track here. I've sort of joked in the past, and I'll leave you both to comment on this as we close. But the challenge, I think, in the past has been, we have talked about reductions in poverty rates. What I'm hearing from both of you is that, yes, there are programs in place that are able to do that. But the greatest thing we have used is the definition of poverty. So if we want less poverty, we just change the definition of poverty a bit. I'm being facetious, Leila, but it almost comes down to that, as opposed to what you're both making a point about is the needs of Canadians.
I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. And, for sure, Campaign 2000 participated in all those consultations that the federal government had around the poverty reduction strategy and choosing a measure. And we had really advocated for a relative measure so we can better understand. And we still use that measure in our report writing. I think it's really essential when we think about how we're defining what do we mean by poverty and connecting it. I think for me, my takeaway is that, or would be that, as Ujwal's been saying, we need to listen to people. We need to listen to communities and individuals who are often the furthest away from these decision-making processes, who are not going to the voting polls. I mean, we saw, voter, I don't know if we can call it repression, but it was very difficult for people to vote this year in a pandemic with less voting polls available. And when you're, really struggling with poverty and trying to work those jobs and get food on your table and make sure your kids are fed, becomes difficult to even get to the voting poll, especially when you feel that the candidates are not talking about your issues. So I think the best thing we can do in terms of changing hearts and minds, whether it's at those kitchen table conversations or with government, is listening to those voices, really authentically listening and shaping our policies and recommendations we put forward, making sure they're driven by those people who are living those challenges day to day. They know exactly what they need to change to be able to thrive in their communities.
Final thought, Ujwal?
Yeah, I think the definition plays a huge role. One of our clients makes plant protein products, right? And they always defined their industry as alternative meats. It wasn't until they actually asked, what does that mean? And finally realized, actually, we play in the plant protein space, not in the alternative meat space. It wasn't until they did that then everything started to trickle down from senior leadership into programs, initiatives, and now they're a leader in this space and the largest manufacturer of ingredients in the space. It starts at the top, and it starts with the right definition. And certainly, to your point, Dave, a definition is not going to solve all of it, but that's the starting point. And we certainly need to be having that conversation more openly and pushing harder on that piece.
Ujwal, Leila, thank you for this. You've given us a lot to chew on and think about. So we might come back and bug you again and talk a little bit more about some of this stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Ujwal Arkalgud is a cultural anthropologist. He's also the founder of Motivbase. Leila Sarangi is the Director of Social Action with Family Service Toronto, and she serves as the National Director for Campaign 2000. In our next episode, we're going to find out more about the ways in which urban planning has effectively created regions of poverty that continue to grow today. Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is an Eye Contact production.